Welcome back to the Iceberg of Economics. This is going to be part 3 of 9. We'll just get straight on to it. The first term now that we're under the surface that I'm going to discuss is the one I probably have the least understanding of, is syndicalism. Syndicalism is a radical, semi-anarchist, socialist. It's kind of a mix of both, where that the government and most businesses and institutions are all controlled by unions. If you wanted to say this in jest, you can argue that the education system in the state of California is syndicalist. By that, the teachers union has a lot of power in deciding how things go there. But really, on a more serious note, it's the idea that you would basically have a general strike where union leaders across all major industries would coordinate and all shut down together to effectively seize control of the government by saying, we're not going to go back to work and we're not going to produce anything unless if the government steps down and allows union leaders and just the unions in general to make decisions on production and rule of law and everything like that. This is very chaotic in nature, an ideology like this, and it did have some traction, particularly in France, the Iberian Peninsula, and Latin America. However, by the end of World War II, syndicalism died out effectively across the world, and the main reason for the death of syndicalism was either authoritarian on the left side of the aisle basically co-opted syndicalism into becoming more authoritarian style communism, as you've seen in the Eastern Bloc and China in the post-World War II world. Or in the West, you saw living standards go up even for the working classes to such a relatively high level that the working classes can now afford to be consumers in the capitalist economy and now have and investors in the financial markets and homeowners and have more of a skin in the game and a stake in the society. And as a result, syndicalism lost its popularity because a lot of the same workers who would be the source to threaten a shutdown of society now have a reason not to want to shut down society and have unions control everything, because they have a stake in it and they benefit from the free market economy. I think syndicalism or neo-syndicalist ideas could pop up in the event that you see too much redistribution up the wealth curve and you see a lot younger generations never buy property or never having meaningful balance in their 401k, and may start to get more sympathetic to this and other more radical left-wing ideas. But for now, syndicalism is in the dustbins of history. The next thing we're going to talk about in the iceberg of economics is central planning. And why central planning is really the idea that you could use a combination of government hired bureaucrats and academics and policymakers can decide how the economy should play out, and with this planning they can create better outcomes than if it was done entirely with the free market. The most common example of this is the Soviet Union and a lot of the communist countries in the 20th century, where you had bureaucrats literally deciding how much bread there was on the shelf and what the salary for every profession in the economy was, and that resulted into a bunch of inefficiencies, which was really the main problem for central planning to that degree. But central planning doesn't have to be just for the whole economy in a totalitarian sense. You could argue that the Federal Reserve is effectively central planning the economy by determining the price of money, because the price of money impacts what loans are viable and what loans are not viable, and therefore what projects can receive capital and what not, and also affects asset prices, like the price of housing is very contingent interest rates. The price of the stock market is heavily contingent on interest rates. And the Federal Market Committee is 12 governors who basically decide what the cost of money should be. That is central planning. It's just not the entire economy, but it effectively is for the financial system. And there are several other regulatory bodies that have similar powers, even in so-called free market economies, to put a lot of central planning into how their sub-industries work. A good example of this was the interview I did with Austin Walters discussing the degree of central planning within the healthcare industry, which has led to a lot of the inefficiencies within the healthcare industry. The next topic we're going to be talking about, central planning, I already hinted at this, is communism. Communism is the idea that you have no private property, effectively. Communism is, and the idea is that proto-communist idea has been around really since Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the emotions that drive communism have been around since the dawn of time, mainly envy. But it really got formalized as a defined ideology through Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. And it had a lot of appeal to people because in a world that got more secular, communism was promising this idea of heaven on earth where there wouldn't be greedy capitalist business owners and wealthy elites who own everything. Everybody would have everything, except there wouldn't be any ownership. Everybody would just share everything out of the goodness of their hearts. And everybody would be prosperous, and everything would be fair, and everybody would be equal. In practice, it didn't really work that way. In most of the authoritarian communist regimes, what happened ultimately was that the political elites still remained on top. They were just a new type of political elites with a new political ideology. But since you didn't really have market forces making the economy efficient or really drive any incentive to drive growth, everybody else became poor. And that was really the flaw of communism. And also there's the calculation problem, which I mentioned in the central planning tidbit, is that it's hard for bureaucrats to basically accurately determine how much bread there should be in every single grocery store in every part of your country, or what should the salary be of every single profession, without creating shortages or gluts for overpaying one group of people relative to the other. And if you pay everybody the same amount of money, no matter what they do for a living, which is the goal of communism, it's for each gives to their ability and takes what they need. You have a lot of disincentives for more skilled people to produce, and you have more incentives for people to do jobs that, or simply not participate. In the authoritarian communist countries, you had to work, or you were basically just cut out of the system or jailed, depending on where we're talking about. But like in the ideal sense, and you didn't really have that type of punishment, which you wouldn't in what would be a true communist society according to the ideologues here, you would have a heavy disincentive for people just to shirk and not participate, because there's no benefit. You get the same benefits as if you do participate, even if you don't. And that's also one of the flaws of communism. So yeah, this ideology was most popular in countries with very stratified social hierarchies, where they accelerated quickly to the market economy before they switched to communism, and there's a lot of disruptions, and there were a lot more losers than winners. And they used this collective force to win. But the thing is that if it wasn't really for the Russian Revolution succeeding, and to get into the causes of the Russian Revolution and why they were able to succeed when other similar revolutions failed in other parts of Europe and in the Americas at the time, it was a whole nother topic, and that's more of a history topic. But I think that the implicit military and financial support from the Soviet Union once they did flip communist was really the big driver for a lot of these other countries turning. If they didn't have the backing of the Soviet Union, I don't think communism would have spread nearly as far as it did in the peak shortly after World War II. But yeah, that's my comments on communism. And socialism, according to the Communist Manifesto, and is the transition stage between communism, which would effectively be an anarchist state with no government, but everybody just voluntarily contributes their piece to the society and splits everything evenly and create their heaven on earth. But the step in between is socialism, where you have the government seize control of all of the businesses and all the means of production, and you have, it's usually authoritarian, but it, in theory, could be democratic, where the government will be the one who decides where to allocate all the resources of the economy. And the difference from a social market economy that I mentioned before is that in a social market economy, private business owners still own the businesses. There still is a private sector. Whereas in a truly socialist economy, there would not be a private sector. Everything would be effectively controlled by the state and owned by the state. And this would just be a transition that the state would do this until people got used to this new system, and then gradually the state would deteriorate and people would naturally just be adapted to a more communist mindset, and it's become self-sustaining. Like by this definition of socialism, a lot of the communist bloc during the Cold War was effectively socialist. Democratic socialism is really social market economy. Democratic socialism, the idea that was popularized by Bernie Sanders in his 2016 and 2020 elections, that you can democratically vote for a more socialist economy, which you have more welfare, higher taxation, more government regulation and control, and arguably even nationalizing some industries. Some countries in Europe actually did go this far and nationalized a lot of industries. India was also a country that went pretty far on the socialist side, where they outright owned a lot of parts of the private sector and different industries. And you have some countries where certain sectors are nationalized and socialized, such as the energy industry in Mexico. But in the 80s, the rest started to heavily deregulate and exit out of these. The most aggressive for these moves was the US and the UK under Reagan and Thatcher, where they sold off a lot of state-owned industries to make their economies more efficient. But yeah, that's socialism. The main difference between socialism and social market economy is direct ownership versus just high taxes. Next, we're going to discuss rent control. Rent control, by definition, is when a jurisdiction puts an effective cap on the amount a landlord can charge in rent to tenants. This can be done in a variety of ways. It can be a hard cap or a hard rent control where you just can't increase prices, period. You can have rent controls where you cannot increase prices by a fixed amount. You can have rent control where rents are not allowed to increase more than CPI or CPI plus a spread. Or you can have just a maximum of what you can raise it by that's fairly high, which diminishes the power of rent control. And you've seen different examples of these across all jurisdictions. The ones with the most onerous levels of rent control are New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles in the United States. But recently they've passed rent controls in general across the state of California for apartments, where it is CPI plus 5% as the cap, which is fairly wide. But like in a time with extreme housing tightness, it could cause a lot of inoptimal outcomes, like what happened the last couple years due to a high shock in rent inflation, where you saw rents going up at one point almost 20% year over year. The reason rent control is probably one of the most flawed economic policies out there, and has one of the poorest empirical track records. And prior to when housing became a major political issue in the last decade, in terms of rent costs, particularly among millennials, it was pretty unanimous for economists to criticize rent controls and denounce them. But now you're starting to see economists on the left sympathize with it because, as I've mentioned before, with economics, it's not just left-wingers who do this. Right-wingers have done this too, with the idea if you could cut taxes and you could generate enough growth automatically that you don't need to cut spending to compensate it. If you want to play critique economists on both sides here. The point being is you've got rent control. The thing is that people will create their economic policies and solutions and ideology based on a political goal they're trying to accomplish. So that's why rent control is no longer a consensus bad idea. There's a reason why it was a consensus bad idea, is because it creates a lot of negative incentives in the real estate market. One, it depresses the values of properties in rent-controlled areas, because if you know that your tenants are stuck in rent control and you can't really evict them unless there's very extraordinary exceptions, such as if you want to own or occupy the place for an extended period of time, then the cash flows are not going to be high enough to justify what like the purchase price is. So people will have to pay a lower price to be compensated for that. But if that was the only problem, I wouldn't really be that strongly against rent control. The main problem is what it does to tenants. One, it discourages people from moving, and that, as a result, tightens the supply of remaining apartments in a city. So say, for example, you have rent control passed 20 years ago, and rent inflation is way higher than what the maximum amount increases under the rent control is. So anybody who got assigned a lease and wants to stay in that city has not moved, because if they move, they're going to have to pay market rate, which will be much higher, because the market rate does move with inflation, real inflation in housing, not the rent control level. The rent control only kicks in after, at least in the way it works in American cities. I think maybe there's other countries, maybe they have hard rent controls, but hard rent controls have their own sets of problems. Well, mainly that there'd be no incentive to develop property or to maintain property. And even in softer rent controls, there still is no incentive to maintain property, because if you're not getting compensated the fair value, you might as well let the apartment degrade and not cover maintenance beyond whatever's the government mandated minimums. Because if the person doesn't like it and doesn't want to stay, then if they move out, you actually benefit from that, because then you could raise the rates back to market rate. But the main problem is people don't move out, and therefore that shrinks the supply. And so the remaining people who are trying to move into a city therefore have to pay more, because there is a tightness in supply that there wouldn't be if there was a more liquid market for rentals. So basically the people who benefit are the people who were there before the rent controls or live in their place for 5+ years. And anybody who either moves around a lot, either due to different jobs or graduating from college and moving to a new city, or your family gets bigger so you can't stay in the studio apartment anymore and have to get a bigger place, they are the losers of rent control. And on the aggregate, the losers of rent control are a lot larger in numbers than the few winners. Like, I remember when I lived in San Francisco, I hear this story about people would move into like a 3-bedroom apartment in North Beach, which is a fairly nice neighborhood in the city, at least back when I lived there. And they would pay $900 a month for this apartment. they got in, they moved in the 80s when it was maybe like that much, and now with the caps and rent controls, maybe the rent is maybe got from $900 a month to $1,200 a month. Whereas if you didn't have rent control and you wanted to get that on the market, that same apartment would be $6,000 a month now. And that is just just like an anecdote, but for a broader problem is that the rent control basically disincentivizes people to move and just artificially restricts a market that a lot of these cities passed rent controls because their markets were tight to begin with and people were complaining about high cost of living. And so the politicians know, why don't we cap the rent to help solve this problem? But really it does, it just makes an already tight housing market worse. You have less incentive to develop the property because you can't raise rents with your costs or with market forces, and you have less incentive to maintain your property. So that's why you see a lot of older, dilapidated properties, especially on the inside in some of these rent-controlled cities. So overall, it's an idea that comes from the right place in the heart, but practically just doesn't work. Next one I'm going to talk about is full reserve banking. I already discussed this in the surface level where we talked about fractional reserve banking. It's the same thing except every dollar in the bank is backed by a dollar in the bank. So there is no money multiplier effect. The main upside of this is that the banking system is a lot more stable because you can't have a bank run if everybody's money is always in the bank. The downside is lending in this environment would be prohibitively expensive because the money supply would be a lot lower, and therefore, since banks have to be paid back on that, and there's really no like liquidity out there, it has to be everything in the bank has to be fully backed, then in order for a bank to even consider taking such a risk of capital impairment on their loans, they would have to lend at very high interest rates, which you could argue could be a good thing if all these loans are just credit card debt or student loans and frivolous majors or other more wasteful parts of money. But a lot of businesses need loans to get started and grow, and basically there'd be no mortgage market in that environment either, because the mortgage interest rates would be so high nobody would be able to afford to borrow to buy a house, and therefore anybody want to buy a house would effectively have to pay for it in cash, which would either means housing prices would be a lot lower, and or people would just be lifelong renters and there'd just be a landlord class that owns all the real estate. So you're basically trading off removing the business cycle for slower growth in a full reserve banking environment. Fractional reserve banking didn't really come from legislation. It was just market forces that banks said, hey, we have all this money and not everybody's going to come and take it back at the same time. So they took a little risk and lent on it. In fact, actually, reserve requirements were a response to banks' before reserve requirements having way too low of a fraction of their banks and their reserves and demand deposits available. And so that it's, if anything, if you're going to have a full reserve banking system, it wouldn't be like what libertarians say in a free market would be full reserve banking. No, full reserve banking would have to be heavily legislated and regulated by the government, because the bankers would have incentives to deviate, even if it's just by a small amount, due to just the upside potential of having much more capital available to lend when nobody else is willing to lend due to having sticking to their full reserve banking commitments. The next one I'm going to talk about is environmental economics, which is kind of the same idea as green growth. It seems like a lot of these on the iceberg is really just talking about economic theories to justify factoring in the negative externalities of the environment and climate change. And that's what environmental economics is. It talks about how the market fails to, on a climate and or environmental adjusted basis, to have a market optimal outcome. The markets are more likely to create negative externalities via pollution, because money today is, especially when interest rates are low, is when interest rates are high, you'd rather have the money today than the money tomorrow. You may not be alive really long enough to benefit, or I guess suffer in this case, from the negative externality. And it also, I think, environmental economics also deals with the tragedy of the commons, where you have a common property resource, and since nobody owns it, there's no reason to protect it and operate in a sustainable way. The example would be like an open pasture that's not fenced off, and all the ranchers go have their cows feed on that pasture because they could keep their grass for themselves on the property they own. They'd rather have it in the eat their cows eat in the open pasture. The problem is every rancher is going to think this way, and therefore pretty soon that pasture is going to be completely barren and have no grass in it at all, because nobody really managed to maintain the proper level of grass, or to allow nature to do its thing and have it grow gradually and not to be overgrazed. The solution to that was, again, private property. If it's your property, you have incentive to take care of it better and make sure that you don't overgraze your property, because otherwise your cows are going to have nothing to eat, or you're going to have to import hay from another farm at a much more expensive cost. I mean, this wasn't tragedy of the commons, but I think I'm going to include that in parentheses here, because we talked about effectively environmental economics when I was discussing green growth. And then the last one we're going to talk about in this section of the economics iceberg are worker cooperatives, which worker cooperatives are basically the organization that would run the world in a syndicalist system. A worker cooperative is the idea of a company that is self-managed and owned by its workers. And I mean, we have employee-owned businesses today. A lot of the companies like especially smaller businesses, where the business owners and the founders are the only people who work there. You have profit sharing agreements and stock option compensation for a lot of technology and big publicly traded companies and startups, where like you compensate the employees at startups less up front, but in exchange they get equity. So if the company grows, they will do better and take some of the winnings from that. But these are a little bit more differently. These are just basically the idea that you have every corporate decision be voted on by the workers, like it's a government or a state election or something like that. Even the companies who give corporate stock options and stock to the compensation to their employees do not give enough that they have enough shares to really influence policy. Whereas in a worker cooperative, in the old school sense of it, it would literally just be divided evenly by all the workers. There wouldn't really be management, or if there was, it would be like a politician is now they're elected in elections for a fixed term, and they would do what in the best interest of the workers. But what I know about worker cooperatives historically, the idea was it was a more direct democracy style for companies. And they have had some success of sticking around longer than other companies, and because they're less likely to vote on, not because necessarily they're better, but they're less likely to vote on approving themselves being acquired. And usually in acquisitions, you have layoffs of redundant workers. So you can see why a worker cooperative would vote against its company being acquired, because some of the synergies would be those workers losing their jobs. And then you also probably have you have lower pay gaps in worker cooperatives than you do in traditional companies as well. Um, Mainly because, again, since people are voting on pay and voting on every major decision, people aren't going to vote for management to have excessively higher pay than they are, uh, because why would you do that? Like, you see how unpopular it is to raise salaries for congressmen in the United States. You can see how that work on a business level too. Um, and so, yeah, the reason why, again, these don't really work that well is because they're not really, it's hard to make longer term strategic decisions. And this is also the flaws of public companies who have to report earnings every quarter, have similar pressure from their shareholders. If you have everything voted on election for the workers, and there's also an agency problem. Even if the workers are shareholders, the workers have different interests than what would be a for-profit shareholder would, and those conflict of interest really hold back worker cooperatives. It's probably why you don't see that many like major large worker cooperatives in the modern era. I mean, they do have some in Europe, and most notably in Italy and Spain and France. It's kind of the same countries where syndicalism was popular. But yeah, I mean, they're generally not major movers and shakers in the business world, and they're not really the source of dynamic growth. Startups are not really worker cooperatives either. But yeah, if it's a very well established industry with not too much growth, they could work. But again, you're trading off, similar to social market economy, you are trading off upside potential and long term thinking in exchange for worker harmony and more social stability, or just less tension between workers and management and workers amongst themselves. That concludes part 3. Well, now we're going to keep getting deeper.